Sir, sir.
A store manager looked at a tired man in a faded navy coat, holding his 7-year-old daughter on his hip at 7:40 on a Tuesday evening, and said the word out loud so that everyone in the front of the store could hear it. Thief. He said it in front of 11 people standing in line. He said it in front of a woman who had been shopping there for 40 years. He said it in front of the man's daughter, who was holding a stuffed rabbit and had just been promised a cinnamon roll on the way home. Then he made the man empty his grocery bag onto the checkout belt, one item at a time, while a cashier filmed it and a loss prevention officer stood between him and the door. Then he called the police. The man let him do all of it. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach into his coat pocket, where a receipt had been sitting, folded in half, since the moment he paid. Because there was something he needed to see first. Nobody in that store knew that the man being searched owned it. Not the building, not the lane, not the vest on the manager's chest. He owned all 31 stores in the chain, and his mother's name was on a plaque 11 feet from where he was standing. If you have ever been treated like you did not belong somewhere you had every right to be, stay with me. Because before this night was over, people would find out what they had actually done, and only one of them would still have a job. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David Ellis had been driving for 6 hours when he pulled into the Fairview lot, and he looked exactly like what he was that night, a man at the end of a long day who had not shaved since Sunday. His coat was navy canvas, worn pale at the elbows, the kind of coat that gets kept because it works and not because anyone admires it. His boots were scuffed to the toe. He had a 7-year-old asleep in the back seat with her cheek against the window and a gray stuffed rabbit wedged under her chin, and he had exactly one thing on his list that could not wait until morning. He did not look like a man who owned anything. That was the point. That had always been the point. Ellis Family Market had 31 stores across Ohio, Indiana, and eastern Kentucky. David had opened the first one at 28 in a leased building with a leaking cooler and a loan he should not have qualified for. He had opened the 31st 11 months ago. In between, there had been years he did not like to describe out loud, because describing them made them sound like a story, and they had not felt like a story while he was inside them. They had felt like a series of Tuesdays. He had a habit that his executives had quietly complained about for a decade. He visited his own stores without telling anyone he was coming, and he did it dressed the way he was dressed now. No annoncement, no walkthrough with the district team. No clipboard. He simply arrived, took a cart, and shopped like a customer, because in his experience there was no other honest way to find out what a store actually was. You cannot learn anything about a place that knows you are watching. Everybody stands up straight for the man in the good coat. Nobody stands up straight for the man in the faded one. And that was precisely the man David wanted to know how his stores treated. Fairview was not on his schedule. Fairview was 200 miles out of his way. He had come because of a letter. It had arrived at the corporate office 11 days earlier in a plain envelope with no return address, handwritten, for paragraphs, and signed. It had not accused anyone of anything specific. That was what made David read it 3 times. It said that the Fairview store had become a place where certain customers were followed and certain customers were not. It said the following was not written down anywhere and never would be. It said that people who worked there had learned which kind of customer they were supposed to notice, and that they had learned it without anyone ever saying it in a sentence. The last line of the letter was the reason David Ellis was standing in his own parking lot at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening with a sleeping child in the back seat. I'm not brave enough to sign this. I'm asking you to come see it. He had not shown the letter to anyone. Not to Barbara Hale, who ran the company day-to-day and would have wanted to send a compliance team. Not to the district director, who would have called the store to warn them, meaning well, and destroyed the only thing the letter was worth. David had put it in his desk drawer and thought about it for 11 days. And then on a Tuesday, he had canceled the dinner, picked up his daughter from his sister's house, and driven 6 hours. He woke Nora in the parking lot the way he always did, with a hand on her ankle and her name said twice. She came up out of sleep the way 7-year-olds do, all at once, offended and awake in the same second. Are we home? Not yet. But getting a few things. Can I have a cinnamon roll? On the way out, if you carry your own rabbit. She considered this the way she considered most offers, with her whole face, and then accepted it. Her name was Nora Ellis. She was 7 years and 4 months old, and the rabbit was named Biscuit and had been gray once and was now a color that did not have a name. She would not sleep without it and had never once been embarrassed about that, which David thought was the single most impressive thing about her. They went in through the automatic doors at 7:19. The store smelled right. That was the first thing he checked, always before anything else. Rotisserie chicken, cut flowers, the faint cold metal smell off the produce misters. The floors were clean. The end caps were faced. 2 lanes open, self-checkout running. A kid in a red vest collecting carts in the rain outside, without complaining about it. On paper, Fairview was a good store. It had been a good store for 6 straight quarters. David took a cart and put Nora in the seat, even though she was getting too big for it, and she let him, which meant she was more tired than she was admitting. He got milk. He got bread, eggs, a bag of the pretzels Nora liked, and 1 bag of the ones he liked, which were worse. He got a rotisserie chicken because it was 7:30 and he was not going to cook. He got a case of bottled water, 24 count, and he did what every single person who has ever bought a case of water in a supermarket does. He put on the bottom rack of the cart. That case of water was going to be the entire reason a man called him a thief 11 minutes later, and David Ellis had no idea, because he had done the most ordinary thing a human being could do inside a grocery store. And 11 feet from the front lane, on the wall between the customer service desk and the exit, there was a small brass plaque that nobody at Fairview had looked at in about 2 years. It had 4 lines on it. David walked past it without reading it because he had written it. The checkout was uneventful, which is the part that matters most, and the part that almost everyone gets wrong when they tell this story afterward. David went to lane 4 because it was the only staffed lane with a light on. The cashier was a young man named Colton Reeves, 22 years old, 8 months on the job, and he was competent and quick and did not say very much. He scanned the milk and the bread and the eggs. He scanned both bags of pretzels. He scanned the chicken. When he got to the end of the belt, he leaned over the register, looked down into the cart, saw the case of water on the bottom rack, and scanned it with the handheld gun without asking David to lift it, because that is what the handheld gun is for. The total was $51.82. David paid in cash, which he did on purpose in his own stores, because cash is the only way to find out whether a lane is actually balanced. He took the change. He took the receipt. He folded it in half without looking at it and put it in the right pocket of his coat, the way he had put 10,000 receipts in 10,000 pockets, and he thanked Colton by name because the name was on the vest. Colton said, "Have a good night." He meant it. He was not the villain of this story, although for the next 40 minutes he was going to behave like one. David pushed the cart 4 steps toward the doors, and Nora asked about the cinnamon roll, and he turned the cart toward the bakery, which meant that for about 90 seconds he was walking away from the exit with a full cart, and then walking back toward it. That was it. That was the whole crime. Grant Weller was standing at the customer service desk with a printout in his hand. He was 54 years old. He had managed Fairview for 6 years, and he had a way of standing in the front of the store that made it clear he was not simply present, he was supervising. He had come up through a different chain in the 90s, one that trained its managers to think of the front of the store as a perimeter. He had never unlearned it. Nobody had ever asked him to. Grant looked up and saw a man in a faded navy coat pushing a full cart back from the direction of the doors, with a case of water on the bottom rack. Here is what Grant Weller believed he saw. He believed he saw a cart that had come from the direction of the exit. He believed he saw a bottom rack item, which is the first line of every loss prevention slide ever made. He believed he saw a man who had not shaved, in a coat that had been worn out rather than styled that way, with a child on the cart seat. He believed he saw all of that in about 1.5 seconds, and then he did the thing that this entire story is actually about. He stopped looking. Everything Grant Weller did for the next 22 minutes, he did in service of a conclusion he had already reached before he crossed the floor. He did not investigate. He confirmed. There is an enormous difference between those 2 words, and most people go their whole lives without noticing which one they are doing. He walked to lane 4 and asked Colton a question. He did not ask, "Did that man pay?" He asked, "Did you wring out the water?" Colton was already scanning a different customer's order. He was 22. His manager was standing over him with a printout, asking a question in a tone that already had a right answer inside it. And Colton did what a 22-year-old does. He tried to remember. He could not clearly remember. He had scanned it with the gun without lifting it, which meant his hands did not have a memory of the weight, which meant the moment had not stored itself anywhere. He said, "I don't think so." He did not say no. He said, "I don't think so," which is a completely different sentence, and Grant Weller heard the version he wanted. Then Grant said the second sentence that shaped everything after it. He said, "Was he in here before?" And Colton, trying to be helpful, trying to be the kind of employee who is useful to his manager, said he was walking around for a while. Every word of that was true. It was also in that room, at that moment, a match struck in a dry field. Grant Weller turned around. David Ellis was 50 feet away by the bakery case, lifting his daughter down off the cart seat, so she could point at which cinnamon roll she wanted, because she was 7 and it mattered enormously which one. Grant keyed his radio and said, "Trent, front. Now." And then he started walking, and by the time he had covered 30 of those 50 feet, he had already decided how this ended. Trent Marsh was the loss prevention officer for the Fairview store. He was 38. He was built like a man who had played something in high school and never entirely stopped. And he had a specific professional flaw that had never cost him anything until this Tuesday. He had never once in 6 years told a store manager that a stop was a bad idea. That is not the same as being cruel. Trent was not cruel. He was agreeable, and in his particular job, agreeable is a kind of weapon that gets handed to someone else. He came around the end of the aisle and fell in beside Grant without asking a single question, which is the detail that would matter most later. He did not ask what the man had taken. He did not ask who had seen it. He arrived already believing, because his manager was already walking. David was crouched down at the bakery case with Nora's hand on his shoulder for balance when the two of them stopped behind him. "Sir." David stood up. He turned around slowly, with Nora's hand still on his shoulder, and he looked at the two men, and he took in the whole arrangement of it in about the same second and a half that Grant Weller had used to decide he was a criminal. Two men, one in a red manager's vest, one in a black polo with a badge clipped to it, positioned so that the cart was behind them and the doors were behind the cart. The manager standing slightly forward. The loss prevention officer standing slightly wide at an angle, which is not an accident and is not casual and is a thing people are taught. David Ellis had been on the receiving end of that geometry before. Not often, but enough times that his body knew it before his mind had finished the sentence. "Yes. Sir, I need you to come with me to the front of the store." "Can I ask what this is about?" Grant Weller said. "I think you know what it's about. There is a category of sentence that exists only to establish who is in charge, and that is one of them. It contains no information. It is not a question. It cannot be answered correctly. It is a door closing with a person on the wrong side of it." David looked at him for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I'd like you to tell me anyway." Nora had gone very still against his leg. She had biscuit under one arm. She was looking up at Trent Marsh, at the badge, at the size of him, with the frank, uncomplicated attention of a child who has not yet learned that you are supposed to pretend not to see things. "Sir, you did not pay for the water on the bottom of your cart, and you have been walking around this store for 20 minutes, and I'm going to ask you one time to come to the front with me." David said, "All right." That was all. He said, "All right," and he picked up his daughter, and he walked to the front of his own store between a loss prevention officer and a store manager, and he did not say another word for the whole length of the floor. He could have ended it there. He knew he could have ended it there. The receipt was folded in half in his right coat pocket, and it was 11 inches long, and it had a case of bottled water printed on it in black ink at 7:28 p.m., and if he had reached in and produced it, Grant Weller would have gone pale and apologized, and the night would have been over and nothing would have changed at all. Nothing would have changed at all. That was the thought that kept his hand out of his pocket. Because a letter had come to his office 11 days ago from a person who was afraid to sign their own name, and it had said, "I am asking you to come see it," and he was in the middle of seeing it, and he had not seen all of it yet. He needed to know how far it went. Not for himself. He had already had this happen to him 3 times in his life, and he was 41, and he had made his peace with the arithmetic of it. He needed to know how far it went, because 31 stores worked for him, and he had a plaque on the wall 11 feet from the door with 4 lines on it that he had written himself. And if what was written on that plaque was not true at Fairview at 7:40 on a Tuesday, then it was not true anywhere. And he had spent 13 years and everything he had building a company on top of a sentence that was not true. So he carried his daughter to the front of the store, and he kept his hand out of his pocket. The front of the store had 11 people in it. There were 4 in line at lane 4 and 3 at self-checkout and 2 at customer service, and a woman by the flower buckets deciding between 2 bunches of carnations, and a young man collecting the last of the carts by the door. Every single one of them saw a man in a faded coat carrying a child, walking between 2 employees toward the customer service desk. They all knew immediately what they were looking at. That is the thing nobody accounts for. The public part of this is not an accident. It is the mechanism. A man is not embarrassed by being accused. He is embarrassed by being accused in a room. Grant Weller stopped at the customer service desk, turned around, and said the sentence that this entire video is named after. He did not lower his voice. He did not step to the side. He was 54 years old, and he had been the manager of this building for 6 years, and he had never in his life been told that the tone he used was a decision. Empty the bag on the belt. Every item. I want to see what we're dealing with, because I've got a thief in my store, and I'd like everyone to understand that we don't just let that happen here. 11 people stopped moving. The woman at the flower buckets put down the carnations. Colton Reeves, at lane 4, stopped scanning with his hand halfway to a box of cereal. And a cashier named Dina Alvarez, who was standing at lane 6 with her light off because her shift had ended 4 minutes earlier and she had not clocked out yet, felt something drop straight through the middle of her chest. Because Dina Alvarez had written the letter. David Ellis set his daughter down. He did it carefully, the way you set down a child in a room that has gone wrong. And he moved her so that she was standing against his left leg rather than in front of him, and he put his hand flat on the top of her head for exactly 1 second, which was a thing he had done since she was 2, and which meant you were fine, this is not about you. Then he lifted the canvas grocery bag onto the belt. All of it, Grant said. Out. David took out the milk and set it down. He took out the bread. He took out the eggs, and he set them down more carefully than the rest, because they were eggs. He took out the bag of pretzels Nora liked, and the bag of pretzels he liked. He took out the rotisserie chicken, still warm, still in its plastic dome, and set it on the belt, and the smell of it went through the front of the store and made the whole thing worse in a way that is difficult to explain but that everybody standing there felt. He did it slowly, not to be theatrical. He did it slowly because he was counting, and what he was counting was how many people would say something. The answer, for the first 90 seconds, was 0. 11 people. 0. And David Ellis, who had spent a lot of his life in rooms like this, was not surprised. And that was somehow the worst part of the night, worse than Grant Weller, worse than a word. Grant Weller was one man having one bad decision. The silence was 11 ordinary, decent people, most of whom would have described themselves as the kind of person who says something, standing very still and waiting for somebody else to be the first. That is not a character flaw. That is just what a room does. Every person in that store was waiting to find out if they were the only one who thought this was wrong, because the price of being the only one is high, and everybody knows the price without ever having been told it. David laid the last item on the belt. He turned the canvas bag upside down and shook it. Nothing came out because there was nothing in it. The cart, Grant said. David walked back to the cart. He crouched, and he got both hands under the case of bottled water, 24 count, 16 pounds, and he lifted it out from the bottom rack, and he carried it to the belt and set it down in front of a store manager and a loss prevention officer and 11 witnesses and his 7-year-old daughter. That's the item, Grant said to the room, to nobody, to himself. That right there. And then he looked at David and said, "Do you have a receipt?" David Ellis looked back at him for a long moment. Here is what was true in that second. The receipt was in his right coat pocket. It had been in his right coat pocket the entire time. It was 11 inches long. It had been printed at 7:28 p.m. on lane 4, and 11 lines down from the top, between eggs LGDOZ and chicken rotis. It said water 24 pk 3.99. Everything Grant Weller had said and done in the last 9 minutes was already, and had always been, a piece of paper folded in half 12 inches from his own hand. David said, "Why are you asking me that now?" Grant blinked. "Excuse me? You call me a thief in front of my daughter about 2 minutes before you asked me if I had a receipt. I'm asking you why the question came second." That is the sentence that changed the room. Not because it was clever, because it was a question that had an answer, and the answer was standing right there in a red vest, and every one of those 11 people heard it and did the arithmetic at the same time. Grant Weller's face did the thing that faces do when a man has been asked something he has never once been asked. It hardened. It did not open, because Grant Weller was not a monster. He was something far more common. He was a man who had never been contradicted by someone he had already filed. "Sir, I'm not going to debate procedure with you. Do you have a receipt or not?" And David Ellis, standing in his own supermarket, with his hand not in his pocket, said, "Not yet." Nora Ellis had been listening to all of it. That is a thing adults forget with astonishing consistency. They believe that a child standing at hip height in a room full of raised voices is somehow not in the room. She had heard the word. She had heard the tone. She had watched her father, who was the most unhurried person she had ever met, take a chicken out of a bag and put it on a belt because a man in a red vest told him to. She had been working on it the entire time, with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who takes questions seriously and has not yet been taught that some questions are not asked out loud. She pulled once on the sleeve of her father's coat. He looked down. Then she turned and looked directly up at Grant Weller and said, clearly, in a voice a child uses in a quiet room, without any idea that it carries, "Why are you being mean to my dad? He paid. I watch him pay. He gave the man money, and the man gave him money back. Nobody said anything. He's not a thief," she said. "He's just tired." There is no adult sentence that can do what that sentence did. Adults say things like this is unacceptable, and I'd like to speak to your manager. And those are arguments, and arguments can be won or lost or waited out. A child does not make an argument. A child describes what she saw, and there is no procedure for that. The woman by the flower buckets made a small sound. Colton Reeves looked at the register in front of him and did not look up for a long time. And Dina Alvarez, at lane 6, with her light off, for minutes past the end of her shift, put both hands flat on the counter because she had discovered that she needed something to hold on to. Grant Weller did not answer the little girl. He looked at her father instead, which was its own kind of answer, and every person in that store watched him do it. David crouched down. He got level with his daughter, which put him below the belt line, below the manager, below the loss prevention officer, and made him for 1 second the smallest person in the room, and he did the bravest thing he did all night. He did not tell her she was right. He said, "Hey, look at me. You didn't do anything wrong. Not one thing. And you don't have to fix this. This is a grown-up problem, and it is being handled by a grown-up. Your only job right now is to hold Biscuit. Can you do that?" She thought about it. Then she nodded once and took hold of the rabbit with both arms and stood there doing her job. David stood back up. And this is the moment where a 74-year-old woman named Eleanor Boyd, who was third in line at lane 4 with a basket containing 2 cans of soup, a birthday card, and a bag of peppermints, put her basket down on the floor. Eleanor Boyd had been shopping at that location since it was a different chain in 1984. She had buried a husband and raised 3 children, and she had been coming to that building every Tuesday for 4 decades. And she was not a brave woman, and she would tell you that herself. She had simply reached the age where the calculation had changed. She had run out of things she was worried about losing. She said, "Young man." Grant Weller turned. "I was standing right there," Eleanor said. "I watched that boy at the register scan the water with the wand. He leaned over the cart, and he did it. I saw it with my own eyes, and I am 74 years old, and my eyes are the only thing about me that still works properly." The front of the store went completely quiet, and Grant Weller, who had a printout in his hand and a loss prevention officer at his shoulder, and 6 years of authority in that building, and a conclusion he had reached 1.5 seconds after seeing a man in a faded coat. Grant Weller looked at a 74-year-old woman who had just handed him the exit, the whole exit, wide open, no cost, no apology required. All he had to do was say, "Let me check that." And he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." That is the second when 11 people stopped wondering. And that is also the second when Trent Marsh, the loss prevention officer, who had not asked a single question since he arrived, felt the first cold drop of something down the back of his neck. Because Trent had been doing this for 6 years. Trent knew what an eyewitness was. Trent had just watched his store manager refuse one. Grant turned back to David Ellis and said, "I'm calling the police." And David Ellis said, "Okay." The dispatcher told Grant Weller that a unit was 6 minutes out. He said it out loud when he hung up to the room, the way a man says a thing when he wants it to do work for him. 6 minutes. 6 minutes is a very long time. Try it sometime. Stand in one place and do not move and do not speak and let 6 minutes happen to you. And understand that 11 people are watching you the entire time. David Ellis put his hand back on top of his daughter's head for 1 second. Then he took off his coat, folded it once, and laid it over the handle of the cart because it was warm in the front of the store and because a man in shirt sleeves with his hands visible and empty is a man who has thought about this before. The receipt was in the pocket of the coat on the cart, 4 feet away, and he left it there. Phones had come out, not held up, not obvious, just angled, low, at hip level, the way people record now, 3 of them, then 5. Nobody was making a production of it. That is not how it happens. It happens with a woman holding her phone against her purse strap at an angle and not blinking. And Grant Weller, who had 6 minutes to fill, did the thing that men do when they can feel a room turning and cannot admit that they can feel it. He kept talking. He explained. To nobody. To everybody. He said that people have no idea what shrink costs a store like this in a year. He said that he was not going to apologize for protecting his associates. He said that in his experience, and he said in my experience twice, the ones who make the most noise about it are always the ones who did it. He said that if the man had simply cooperated from the beginning, this would have been resolved in 30 seconds. David Ellis had not said a single word in 4 minutes. That is what Grant Weller could not survive. Not the eyewitness, not the child, the silence. Because a man who is arguing with you is confirming that you are worth arguing with. And a man who simply stands there, calm, holding his daughter's hand, waiting for the police that you called, is doing something to a room that you cannot stop with any sentence available to you. At 4 minutes, Trent Marsh spoke for the first time since he had arrived. He said, quietly, out of the side of his mouth, "Grant, let's just pull the tape." 9 words. 6 years too late, but 9 words, and they were the right ones, and Grant Weller said, without turning his head, "We'll pull it for the officer." Trent Marsh stepped back half a step. That half step was the entire rest of his career, and he did not know it yet. At 3 minutes, Dina Alvarez clocked out. She did it because her hands needed a task. She stood at the terminal at the end of lane 6, and she put in her number, and the screen said, "Thank you, and have a good evening." And then she stood there and looked at the screen and did not move. Dina Alvarez was 34. She had 2 kids and a mother with a bad hip and $11.40 an hour, and she had been at Fairview for 3 years. She had written 4 paragraphs by hand on a Sunday night in October and driven to a post office 2 towns over to mail it because she was afraid of the postmark, and she had not slept properly since. She had written that letter because of a Tuesday in September when she had watched Grant Weller follow a woman with a stroller through the whole store while a man in a golf shirt walked out with a bottle of bourbon under his jacket in front of God and everybody. She had written it because of a boy in a hoodie who had been asked to leave his backpack at customer service while 3 other kids with backpacks walked straight past. She had written it because nobody at Fairview had ever said a single word about race out loud. Not once. And everyone knew exactly what the rules were anyway. And now there was a man in shirt sleeves standing at the front of the store with his daughter, and the police were 3 minutes out, and Dina Alvarez had written a letter asking somebody to come and see this. And the whole time she had been imagining that somebody would come with a clipboard. She had never once imagined that she would have to be the person who said it. She looked at the front of the store. 11 people, 3 of them recording. A 74-year-old woman with her basket on the floor. A little girl holding a rabbit with both arms because her dad had given her a job. 2 minutes. And Dina Alvarez, who was 34 and had 2 kids and a mother with a bad hip and $11.40 an hour, walked out from behind lane 6. She did not say anything dramatic. What she said was, "Grant, I'm going to pull the lane 4 transaction log." Grant Weller turned around and looked at her with an expression that a lot of women watching this will recognize instantly, because it is not anger. It is the look a man gives a woman who has just done her job in a way that costs him something. It is a look that says, we're going to talk about this later. He said, "Dina, you're off the clock." And Dina Alvarez said, "Yes, I am." And she walked past him a lane 4, and Colton Reeves moved aside without being asked, and she keyed the terminal and pulled up the transaction log for lane 4 for the last 30 minutes, and it took her 11 seconds. 11 seconds. Everything, the word, the bag, the belt, the chicken, the child, the police, all of it had been 11 seconds away the entire time, and nobody had spent them because the only person in the building who had the standing to demand them had been the one who did not want them spent. Dina turned the screen. 7:28 p.m. lane 4. Transaction ending 441. 5182 cash. Line 11. Water, 24 pack, $3.99. The front of the store did not gasp. That is a thing that happens in movies. What actually happened was that a woman by the flower buckets said, "Oh my God," very quietly, and Colton Reeves put his hand over his mouth, and Eleanor Boyd said, "I told you," to nobody in particular, and Trent Marsh closed his eyes for one full second. And Grant Weller said, "That doesn't mean," and then he stopped, because there was nowhere for that sentence to go. There has never been anywhere for that sentence to go. David Ellis reached over to the cart, picked up his coat, took the receipt out of the right-hand pocket, unfolded it once, and held it out. It was 11 inches long. It had been there the whole time. Grant Weller looked at the receipt in the man's hand, and he did not take it. He could not make his arm do it. David said, "It's been in my pocket since 7:28. "Then why?" Grant's voice had lost about 40% of its volume. "Then why didn't you show it to me?" And David Ellis said the sentence that this whole night had been built toward. "Because I want to know how far you would go without it." He let that sit for a second. You had 11 seconds available to you from the moment you crossed the floor. You had a cashier who could have checked. You had a camera. You had a woman who told you she watched it happen with her own eyes, and you told her to step back. You had a 7-year-old tell you her father paid, and you didn't look at her. You had a loss prevention officer standing next to you who told you to pull the tape, and you told him you'd do it for the officer. You had everything you needed to be right, and every single time, you chose to be certain instead. Grant Weller said, "Who are you?" And that was the exact moment that the automatic doors opened. It was not the police. The police were still 90 seconds out. It was a woman in a gray wool coat with rain on the shoulders of it, 58 years old, moving across the front of the store at a speed that did not match her clothes. Barbara Hale had been president of Ellis Family Market for 9 years. She had been at a district dinner 40 minutes away when a text came through from a number she did not have saved. The text was a 9-second video filmed at hip level, and it was 11 words long. "Is this David? Fairview. Someone's calling the cops on him." She had left her salad on the table. Barbara crossed the front of the store, and she did not look at Grant Weller. She did not look at Trent Marsh. She walked directly to a man standing in his shirt sleeves next to a checkout belt covered in his own groceries, and she said, in a voice that carried the whole width of the front end because she did not lower it, "David, I am so sorry." Then she turned around. "For everyone in this store who does not know," she said, "this is David Ellis. He is the founder and the owner of Ellis Family Market. He owns this building. He owns the lane you are standing at, the vest you are wearing, and the 30 other stores with his name on the sign. I report to him. Everyone in this company reports to him." Colton Reeves sat down on the little stool behind lane 4. He did not decide to. His legs did it. Grant Weller did not move at all. He stood in the middle of the front end with a printout still in his hand, and he had the specific stillness of a man whose understanding of the last 20 minutes has just been completely rebuilt around a new fact, and who has not yet worked out where he is standing inside the new version. And Nora Ellis, who had been holding Biscuit with both arms for 11 minutes because it was her job, looked up at her father and said, in a whisper that everybody heard, "Daddy, do you know her?" And David Ellis looked down at his daughter, and something in his face came apart and reassembled into something warmer, and he crouched down and said, "Yeah, baby, I know her. She's my friend. She's been my friend a long time." The police arrived 40 seconds later. 2 officers. The first one through the door was a woman named Officer Dana Whitcomb, and she took approximately 8 seconds to read the room. A man in shirt sleeves with a child, a store manager who had gone gray, a president of a company standing between them, 11 people with their phones out, and she said carefully, "Who called?" Grant Weller raised his hand about 6 inches. It was the smallest movement of his entire life. Officer Whitcomb looked at David Ellis. "Sir, do you want to make a complaint?" And David Ellis said, "No, ma'am. I want to buy my groceries and take my daughter home. But I'd like your name and badge number for the record, if that's all right, because there's going to be a record." She gave them. She wrote nothing else down. And then she and her partner stood at the front of the store, off to the side, and did not leave because Officer Whitcomb had been doing this for 11 years, and she knew that the most interesting thing that was going to happen in her entire shift was about to happen right here. David Ellis picked up his coat and put it back on. Then he walked 11 feet across the front of the store to the wall between the customer service desk and the exit, and he stopped in front of a small brass plaque that nobody at Fairview had read in about 2 years. "Grant," he said, "come here, please." Grant Weller came. There was nothing else available to him. "Read it out loud." There was a long pause. Somebody's phone was recording it. It has been watched a great many times since. Grant Weller read, Ruth Ellis, 1949 to 2023. 26 years on a checkout lane. She was never once treated the way she treated everyone. There is not much sound in a supermarket at 7:50 on a Tuesday. There was less than that. David said, "That's my mother. That plaque is in all 31 stores. It's in yours. It's been on that wall for 2 years and 11 feet from where you call me a thief, and I would bet everything I have that you have never read it." Grant Weller did not answer, which was the answer. "My mother worked 26 years on a lane like the one you just made me empty my bag onto. Halvorson's on Route 4 from 1979 until they closed it. 6 days a week. She had one pair of shoes for work, and she put cardboard in them when the soles went, and she stood on a rubber mat for 8 hours a day, and by the time she was 50, her ankles looked like something that had been through a war. And I want to tell you the thing about my mother that actually matters, because it is not the ankles. She was cheerful every single day. She learned people's names. She knew which regulars had had a surgery, and she asked about it. She kept peppermints in her drawer for kids, and she was not supposed to, and she did it for 26 years. And customers looked straight through her like she was part of the register. Grown adults would take their change out of her hand and never once look at her face. She was invisible in that building for 26 years, and she was the best thing in it. When I was 9, I asked her why she was so nice to people who were not nice to her, and she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, because being treated like nothing teaches you exactly what it costs. And once you know what it costs, you don't hand it to anybody else. I built this company on that sentence. Every store, every lane, every vest, 31 buildings, and 4,000 people. All of it is a sentence my mother said to me in a kitchen in 1994. So when you ask me who I am, I'm Ruth Ellis's son. And you spent 22 minutes tonight doing to me the exact thing that she spent 26 years having done to her in a building with her name on the wall in front of her granddaughter. You didn't fail a customer tonight, Grant. You failed the only thing this company is actually for. Grant Weller said, "I didn't know." And David Ellis said, very quietly, "I know you didn't. That's the whole point. That's the entire point. You didn't know who I was, and you decided anyway. If I'd been anybody else, if I'd been a man in a faded coat who was just a man in a faded coat, with a daughter and a receipt in his pocket, and no plaque on your wall, and no company behind him, every single thing you did tonight would have worked. He had been taken out of here in front of 11 people. Nobody would have made a video. He'd have gone home and never come back and never told anybody. And you would have gone to bed a good man. How many times has that already happened in this building?" Grant Weller did not answer that either. "That's what I came here to find out," David said. "And now I know. Here is where most stories end, with a firing, and everybody feels good for 4 seconds. David Ellis did not do that. What he did took 11 minutes, and it is the reason people are still arguing about this in the comments. He started with Colton Reeves, 22 years old, sitting on a stool behind lane 4 with his hands between his knees. "Colton, look at me. You scanned that water. You did your job correctly. And then your manager stood over you and asked you a question that already had an answer in it, and you gave him the answer he wanted because you're 22 and he signed your schedule. I'm not going to pretend that isn't human, but I need you to understand what your one sentence did tonight, because you're going to be a manager someday, and this is the only cheap lesson you will ever get about it. You said, "I don't think so," when the honest answer was, "I don't remember. Let me check." For words, that's the whole difference. That's 22 minutes and a police call and my daughter watching me empty a bag. Colton said, "Yes, sir," and his voice did not work properly. You keep your job. You're going to spend one shift a week for the next month working with Dina, and she's going to teach you what checking looks like. That's not a punishment. That's the most valuable month you'll ever get paid for. Then Trent Marsh. Trent, you told him to pull the tape. That was correct, and it was 4 minutes too late, and you said it out of the side of your mouth so that nobody would have to hear you disagree with your manager in public. 6 years you've been the loss prevention officer here. You arrived tonight beside him without asking a single question about what I was supposed to have taken. Not one. Your whole job is the question. If you're not the question, you're just the muscle, and I don't need muscle in my stores. Trent Marsh said, "I know. You're suspended pending review, and I'm telling you straight that I don't know yet how that ends." That's not me being cruel. That's me not lying to you at 8 o'clock at night to make this room more comfortable. Then Grant Weller. Grant, you're done. Not because you were wrong. Everybody is wrong. You're done because at 4 separate moments tonight, somebody handed you the truth for free, and every single time you decided that being right was less important than being certain. A cashier could have checked. A camera could have checked. A 74-year-old woman told you what she saw with her own eyes, and you told her to step back. Your own loss prevention officer told you to pull the tape, and you refused. A child told you her father paid, and you didn't look at her. A person can be wrong. A person can be trained. There is no training for a man who will not look. He said it without any heat at all, which everybody who has watched the video says is the part that gets them. Effective immediately. Barbara will handle the rest. Grant Weller stood there for a second. Then he did the small automatic thing that men do. He straightened his vest, once the last intact piece of anything he had, and he walked toward the back of the store, and he did not say another word, and that was the last time anybody in that building ever saw him. And then David Ellis turned around and looked at Dina Alvarez. You wrote the letter. Dina Alvarez did not say anything at all. Her chin went once. 4 paragraphs. Handwritten. Mailed from 2 towns over because you were worried about the postmark. Last line, "I am not brave enough to sign this. I am asking you to come see it." He held her eyes. "Ma'am, I drove 6 hours tonight because of you. I want you to hear that in front of every person in this store. I have 4,000 employees in a compliance department and an ethics line with a 900 number on a poster in every break room. And none of that worked. You did. A piece of paper and a stamp and one person who couldn't sleep. And then tonight, off the clock with a manager standing right there who was going to make you pay for it. You walked out from behind that lane and pulled the log. 11 seconds. You were the only person in this building who spent them. You weren't brave enough to sign it. You were brave enough to do it in a room in front of everybody when it was going to cost you. That's the only kind of brave that has ever actually existed. The other kind is just paperwork. Dina Alvarez had both hands over her face by then. Eleanor Boyd, 74 years old, walked over and put a hand on her back without saying a word, which is a thing that women of a certain age do and men mostly do not know how to do at all. Barbara, David said, "Effective Monday, Dina Alvarez is the front-end manager of this store, and I want her in Columbus in 3 weeks because she's going to help us write something." He bought his groceries. That is the detail nobody expects and everybody remembers. He put every item back in the canvas bag himself. The milk, the bread, the eggs, both bags of pretzels, the chicken that had gone cold. And he carried the case of water to the front, and he got in line behind Eleanor Boyd, and he waited his turn like a man. And then he bought his daughter a cinnamon roll, because he had promised. Officer Dana Whitcomb held the door for them on the way out. She said, "Have a good night, sir." She meant it in the way that people mean things when they have just watched something they intend to tell their spouse about. Nora fell asleep in the car before they hit the county line, with biscuit under her chin and a cinnamon roll she had eaten exactly 1/3 of on her lap. For months later, On a quiet Thursday, a woman came through the doors of the Fairview store with a stroller and a diaper bag and the particular exhaustion of somebody who has not had a full night's sleep since March. She had a coupon that had expired 11 days ago, and she did not know it. Dina Alvarez was at the front of the store. She came out from behind the counter before the woman reached a lane. She said her name. She asked how she could help. She took the coupon, looked at it for about a second and a half, said, "That's fine, we'll take it," and did not make one single expression about it. The woman's shoulders came down about 2 inches. Anyone who has ever been that tired knows exactly what 2 inches is worth. At the back of the store, near the flowers, a man in a faded navy coat stood with a 7-year-old and watched the whole thing without announcing himself, because that is still the only honest way to find out what a store actually is. On the wall of every Ellis family market, all 31 of them, 11 feet from the door, right beside the brass plaque with Ruth Ellis's name on it, there is now a second plaque. It is smaller. It has one paragraph on it, and it is called the Ruth Rule, and it was written by David Ellis and Dina Alvarez in a conference room in Columbus over 2 days. It says, "Before you approach any customer about anything, you must be able to answer one question out loud. What did I actually see? Not what I concluded. What I saw. If you cannot say it in a sentence that a 7-year-old would agree with, you do not have a reason. You have a feeling. And in this company, a feeling is not a reason to take a person's dignity in front of a room." Nora Ellis looked up at her father in the back of the store, by the flowers, watching a tired woman with a stroller get treated like a human being. "Is that what it's supposed to look like?" And David Ellis said, "Yeah, baby, that's exactly what it's supposed to look like. Here's the thing that keeps me up about this one." David Ellis had a receipt in his pocket the whole time. He had a company behind him. He had a plaque on a wall with his own mother's name on it, 11 feet away. Almost nobody does. Most of the people this happens to are just a person in a faded coat, tired at the end of a Tuesday, holding a child with nothing in their pocket but a receipt that nobody bothers to ask for until after they have already been called a thief in a room full of strangers. And they go home, and they do not come back, and they never tell anybody, and the man in the red vest goes to bed thinking he had a good day. The only thing that stopped it in that store was not the owner. It was a 34-year-old cashier with 2 kids and $11.40 an hour, who spent 11 seconds that nobody else would spend. So let me ask you 3 things, and I read every single one of these. Was David right to let it go that far? Or should he have shown the receipt the second the word came out of that man's mouth? Should Trent Marsh have kept his job? And this is the real one. Have you ever been the person in the room who saw it happening and didn't say anything? I have. Tell me about it. There is no judgment in this comment section, only company. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We tell one of these every week, and the next one is about a woman who was told to use the service entrance at her own daughter's wedding venue. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of each other out there.